or on the other side, but some projects which are there on one side of the border to export energy to the other side of the border. Here at the Wilson Center, we've done a number of projects over the years looking at wind, solar, municipal solid waste as sources of renewable energy. And we have worked closely with the NAD Bank and with the BEC on this. And the renewable energy side of things is, of course, crucially important because the border is such an environmentally sensitive area. And it's one of the issues that, of course, is going to be discussed in the coming months when we begin to talk about a large-scale development of shale on both sides of the border and to deal with water resources as well as land use issues. Without any further ado, I am going to ask our panel, Bill Bojorquez, Vice President of Planning for Hunt Power, to kick us off. And I hope we'll have a short time for discussion and questions afterwards. Bill.
Thank you, Duncan. It's a pleasure being here. I have a short presentation. Do you have the clicker for the... Appreciate the opportunity to introduce our company and our thoughts and ideas about both the electric infrastructure across the border as well as the reform and what kinds of things we're looking forward in terms of improve and increased trade between the U.S. and Mexico. So just by way of introduction, I work for a company called Hunt Power. Hunt Power is one of many companies at Hunt Consolidated. It includes ranching, real estate, and of course a new office we're opening in Mexico for Hunt Mexico operations. But the better business or the well-known business of the Hunts are the Hunt Oil. This is a family-owned business, of course, and have been headquartered in Dallas and been operating at the border region for a very, very long time. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. There's two affiliate utilities. One is Hunt Sherryland Utilities, also headquartered in Dallas. I have the ownership information. We're a growing regulated utility in the state of Texas. Hunt Transmission, Hunt Power are unregulated businesses looking at opportunities in western states of the U.S. and the Southwest Regional Power Pool, as well as in Mexico. And it's through Hunt Power that we're looking at investment in Mexico, in the border, to facilitate a lot of the infrastructure needs for the region. So, in a nutshell, you all know about the major trends. You know about the reform. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm going to focus on the energy sector and the power sector specifically. We all know there's a large demographic growth, both indigenous and migrant workers. We have a large labor force at both sides of the border. We've heard from Duncan about the electricity prices that affect the region and the fact that we have to keep up with the growth. Particularly in the industrial sector, where some of the maquiladoras and other energy-intensive uses require very costly power. Yet, at the other side of the river, we may have capacity to trade generation, wind resources in Texas, for example, that at very early stages we have been testing and demonstrating that if you build infrastructure to cross the border, there will be healthy trade. So the other part of this is also discussing renewable energy is that I don't know how much you know, but interior Mexico peaks at a different month of the year, a different time of the day than the U.S. So there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained based on trade because we build capacity to meet those peak demands, right? Electricity cannot be very efficiently stored, so we have to produce it at the same time as consumed. And we build power plants to meet that peak demand, that peak hour of the year on both countries, right? So if we can imagine sharing more of that capacity where, you know, interior Mexico peaks at 7 p.m., our peak demand in Texas is already dying down. Our wind resources in the Panhandle are picking up. Or think about a world where we have peak demand in New Mexico and Texas around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And in Hermosillo, you have plenty of solar resources in the state of Sonora where we can import solar at 1 or 2 p.m. where they peak in the solar time frame, yet at the same time we're peaking in demand in the U.S. Those are great opportunities to talk about in the renewable energy sector. But the critical requirements in infrastructure and the lack of infrastructure is very evident. If you compare the border between Canada and the U.S. versus the Mexican border with U.S., there are literally thousands of megawatt hours traded with Canada when there's low wind or hydro generation available to meet the U.S. demand. In the wintertime, we utilize thermal units, and we trade with Canada northbound to take advantage of the fact that we have a lot of capacity installed in the summer that doesn't get used in the winter, so we support Canada in the winter. But that is huge in terms of capacity and in terms of interconnections with Canada compared to Mexico. We have less than 1% of the peak supply in terms of capacity between the U.S. and Mexico today. And some of these ties, especially the ones along the Texas border, which I've been working on for the last 10 years, have only been finished over the last 6, 7 years. So we have a very small history of interfaces or building infrastructure across the Rio Grande River with Texas. The two ties in the Baja area, those were there historically because Baja was closer to connect to California electrically, and so those systems actually operate synchronously. And Baja is separated from the rest of Mexico electrically. So the reason there's more capacity between Tijuana and San Diego and between the central state of Texas and Mexicali is because those systems grew up together and they are connected from the beginning. But going eastbound, the states of Arizona and New Mexico have little to no infrastructure today. We have been looking at basic emergency supply power transmission lines across the river only. And it's not until we built these called DC or VFT devices that we can actually trade continuously with Mexico. So let's talk a little bit about the technology. Because we're not tightly integrated like we're with Canada, we need to convert AC power to DC back to AC through these stations, these devices. This is one that the Hunt family built in the McAllen area back in 2007. We've had great success with. We're actually doubling the capacity as we speak. By the middle of the summer, we will have 300 megawatts. And what's a megawatt? A megawatt is about a city block of load, a super Walmart, a hospital. So 300 megawatts is not a lot. The total generation fleet in Texas is 70,000 megawatts. The fleet in Mexico is 50,000 megawatts. So that's less than 1% of the possible capacity that we share through these devices. And we have a wealth of opportunity because both of the Reforma as well as because of the ability to trade energy today, renewable energy in the future. This is kind of a success story we like to share. This railroad DC tie was in operations, commissioned in 08, built in 07, commissioned in 08. We started transacting in 09 as parties began to understand and do actual agreements for that trade. The utilization has gone up and up. In 2012, we peaked, and that was a very, very hydro-constrained year. There was a big drought in Mexico in 2012. So this was a huge help to the country of Mexico. And that's the reason why in 2013 we went down a little bit. They had better hydro conditions. So we know that if we build them, they will utilize. Problems, biggest problems, that there's no ability to, for long-term commitments, in other words, long-term contracts for power sales and purchases, and no access to the retail end users like we have in Texas and other places. So if we fix the longer-term PPAs or ability to enter into purchase agreements, and we fix the ability to reach the retail customers, the industrials, on both sides of the border, we can begin to do more of these DC ties and begin to trade more heavily. These are just a few other examples of projects. I mean, we're working on at the border a line to Brownsville. We think an interconnection at Matamoros or Brownsville will be great. We want to interconnect at Juarez, El Paso. We're also working on a Sonora interconnection. And then these are other transmission projects that facilitate power movement across the border states. One other point, that besides sharing the Eagle Ford Shale, we share some of the best solar radiation resources in the world across the Arizona, New Mexico, and Sonora region. We also have access to some of the world-class wind resources, both in northwest Texas in the Panhandle, as well as in western New Mexico. So the ability to trade on those different coincidence peaks, remember, they peak in May, we peak in July, we peak in 3 to 4 afternoon, they peak in the evening. There's just a lot of potential to use up those resources more effectively. And I won't spend too much time about the reform. Needless to say, cross-border will only get better if we open up the markets, if we allow generators to compete on both sides, if we allow retail access, as we have in Texas, or if we just allow bilateral contracts to go across these interties through long-term commitments or long-term contracts. I thank you, and I'll save some time for the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it straight over to Gerardo Schwebel, a good friend of ours from IBC Bank, who was very kind to actually host me when I was down in Laredo recently. I know that you're very involved in the financing side of energy at the border. So, Gerardo, over to you.
Can I do it from here?
Wherever you would like, wherever you're comfortable.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to the Wilson Institute and to the Border Trade Alliance, organization very dear to my heart. Very much involved in a number of issues. I guess the basic question is, what is a banker doing here talking about energy? And, and so let me preface some of my remarks by saying that I consider myself to be more of an economic developer because that's what banks should be engaged in. So therefore, I focus on the practical side of the coin of what it is that impacts our region and how the changing landscape of our part of the world is really is looking like. And I'll start off by saying and quoting a very distinguished and famous philosopher who many of us like to read about and value his comments to be very, very important. The very smart Yogi Berra, who once said that in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. So when we look at what we do in our part of the world, we've been focusing a lot on practicing a lot of the theory that many specialists, both in the government sector, or perhaps in the academic sector, or perhaps even in the private sector, tend to think that what we all should focus on. I'd like to present to you a landscape of what our part of the world is. Back in South Texas and in Texas in general, which is everybody knows how important it is in the energy sector. South Texas was also a very important part of Texas. South Texas became an integral part of that success of Texas. In the 70s, natural gas really, to pun the term, exploded. And we saw that that energy sector of Texas presented a lot of great opportunities for the border region. The 70s came, we saw a lot of landowners and the exploitation of natural gas and oil becoming so important for the economic vitality of our part of the world. And then we enjoyed that. And as bankers, we saw the growth in the changing landscape of what that wealth meant to us. Now here we are, many years later, and we're looking and talking about the new landscape of the changing landscape of what Mexico brings to the table, and how we in the United States will cope with the new role of U.S. Mexico relations in the energy sector. So things haven't changed, quite frankly, Duncan, in those years. We still are focusing on infrastructure issues. Infrastructure has never been ahead of the curve. We've always been behind. So now, in the old days when we used to talk about what what the governments will do to change that landscape. And we talked about it in the old days of the NAFTA, pre-NAFTA years, talking about learning terms of WTO and NAFTA and the GATT. Now we're talking about pipelines, and we're talking about megawatts, and we're talking about, what that paycheck will look like when someone actually comes to the bank and deposits that, or what financing opportunities will come about. That's the practical reality of what I face every day. So I support and focus a lot of my attention on how can we be part of that changing landscape, and how do we adapt. And I think that's the word that I want to leave with each and every one of you all. We in the border, there's one word that really resonates for those of us that grow up and live and work, and that's adapting. Adapting to what the governments think we should do, and adapting to the markets and how they react to those decisions by the government. So being on the border, we focus on what happens in Mexico. It impacts us. We say that when things are tough in Mexico, things are good on the border. When things are good in Mexico, things are good on the border. And on the U.S. side, same thing. So we adapt accordingly, and yet we continue to battle the same issues of inadequate infrastructure for our ports of entry operations, inadequate planning, and at the same time, we as an organization such as this, and now the Wilson Institute, I think we should learn that we've got to come here to Washington or go to Los Pinos and say that we are the actual stakeholders of what those decisions, really mean to us. So that landscape now changes in this way. Positively for us, yes. Those changes seem to be robust. There seems to be a euphoria of what all this will mean for the future, but we must adapt and plan accordingly. Our communities up on the border basically are rural communities, smaller populations of less than 250, many of them, if you want to consider other cities, north of the border. San Diego is a large community. But when you look at cities like Nogales, and you look at cities like San Luis Rio Colorado, or you look at even El Paso and Laredo del Rio and all those up and down the border, they're basically rural communities. We control our own destiny. So we rely primarily on that trade between Mexico. Now the energy sector becomes a new component, and that landscape becomes increasingly more important. But we live with those decisions. So the challenge that we have is quite frankly, sometimes the regulatory environment that we're in my business, banking, most regulated sector. Energy sector is over heavily regulated sector. So how our governments will focus on those new regulations is something that we need to adapt ourselves to. So I also wanted to share with you that as a rural communities that we are, that rapid growth of that euphoria presents a new challenge. Population is increasing. Communities are seeing revenues, really many of them. You take an area of South Texas, LaSalle County, when the first Eagle Ford wells were drilled back in 2008, they were talking about ad valorem taxes, revenues for that, for LaSalle County being about $280 million, and you're looking at about $6 billion today. So how do those cities cope with that added revenue and that growth? I drive up I-35 every weekend, and I see that growth in Cotulla, Texas, and in Dilley, Texas, and those will become names that you all will know over the next 20, 30 years will come very synonymous with the energy sector and the changing environment. So if you want to come down and see, you really want to know what the impact is, don't just fly into Laredo, Texas, or to San Antonio. Fly into Laredo, Texas, and drive up from Laredo to San Antonio and see what we call the Christmas trees. And see the railroads, and see all that activity, see the trucks on a 4-lane I-35 corridor that should be a 6-lane highway instead of a 4-lane highway, and see that the infrastructure is still behind and is still lacking. So I want to trigger with that my comments, trigger some questions to you all, and share with you that from my perspective, the practical side is what I live every day, and that's the story that I come and try to tell when I come to Washington or when I go to Mexico City.
Gerardo, thank you so much. We will come back to you with questions in a second. It's a great delight for me to be able to introduce you Fernando Alonso. We had the chance to work together a few years ago in Mexico on energy issues. And Fernando is going to talk to us today from the point of view of the natural gas sector, the natural gas transportation.
Let's see my presentation. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Wilson Woodruff and the Asociación de Empresarios Mexicanos and from Mexico for this invitation. Let me, before to start, only to mention something, facts of our company. Fermaca is the only Mexican company that is involved in the development and construction of national gas pipelines. And also we are in the power business and in the compression business. Okay. Let me start mention that the production of shale gas or shale natural gas in the United States has surprised the world by its rapid development and impact on the decrease in fuel prices and increased reserve hydrocarbons. This development has grown along with the supply of oil and natural gas condensates. The renewed momentum of non-conventional oils begins to seen as an energy revolution to give new dynamism to the economy of the United States. Due to the increase in the United States, the price of natural gas has decreased substantially compared to other fuels. Even though Mexico is estimated to have the 6th largest shale gas reserves in the world, Mexican consumption is about a tenth of its northern neighbor. If we consider how the net imports have increased over time, it's evident that Mexico is starving jet rich in gas. About 3/4 of natural gas production comes from associated gas that is produced at Pemex offshore oil platforms in the southeast region. Natural gas production in the south is expected to grow only by 0.4% per year through 2019. Pemex consumes increasing amount of this production in the near term for its exploration, production, and refining activities. With the stagnant growth in the production of associated gas in the southeast and limited capacity for future growth in LNG imports, pipeline imports from the United States become the primary means for Mexico to satisfy national demand growth. As you can see the difference between the development of the infrastructure in Mexico and the United States. You can see that in the United States you have around 500,000 kilometers of pipelines. Meanwhile, in Mexico, we have only 12,000 kilometers of pipelines. In the short term or in the next 4 or 5 years, we'll increase this amount of pipelines in Mexico of around 6,000 kilometers, that it will be close to the 50% of the current capacity. That is, it's a lot, but not enough in Mexico. It's going to be one of the largest investments in one administration. We are talking about that the investment is going to be around $17 billion in the near future. But we need a bit more of that. Right now, it's much more cost-effective for Mexico to buy cheap gas than to explore and develop at high cost. Now we have to wait that to pass the reform and to implement it. Because right now, still Pemex has a fiscal problem, that now it's better that to produce more oil, the relation of cost and price of sale between oil and gas is much more productive for the state. So it's a matter of fiscal issue. The Mexican system backbone is linear, with low quality production in the south. This is highly inefficient. Gas shortages in 2013 due to this bottleneck caused the Mexican industry losses for $2.25 billion US dollars. We need to build new infrastructure and took full advantage of other import points, like the Tarahumara pipeline that we built it in and finished the last year from Ciudad Juárez to Chihuahua. Some of the Mexican gas reserves are located close to where import pipelines need to be built. The investment we make today will be useful in the future to bring our gas to central Mexico and the northeast, the heavily industrial zones. The Minister of Energy has previously made projections that assume more robust investments in the development of new gas fields and a more aggressive and diverse range of well productivity rates. Sener's high natural gas production growth projections, including the undertaking of an initiative to enhance recovery rates in the southeast of both gas and oil extract from offshore fields in the Yucatan Peninsula, as well as the development in the northeast of Sabinas Play. Let me conclude. You mentioned that both countries are rich in gas, but U.S. has exploited the resources and Mexico has not. Given the condition right now, it's much more cost-effective for Mexico to build the necessary cross-border infrastructure than to develop the know-how and investment on drilling for shale gas. It will take some time because in Mexico we don't have the experience and technology of the shale gas. We are starting with a few tries to start to drilling shale gas. We'll need billions of dollars in new gas service industries, fracking, technology, access roads, storage, offtake pipelines, gas processing. This is going to take some time. But now already we have the regulatory conditions and the local engineering, procurement, and construction companies' expertise to develop this infrastructure, but require the support of anchor consumption such as Comisión Federal de Electricidad or committed industrials. That it's something that we have to change in the future. Import pipelines in Mexico will continue serving well into the future. Some of them, particularly in the Northeast, may incorporate gradually some of the new domestic production as natural resources know no political limits. The drop in the natural gas prices has a profound impact both to the USA and Mexican markets. And we hope that we continue with these prices in the future. The energy reform will allow our country to increase our oil and natural gas production. It will take some time, probably after the reform passes, but we'll see some results in 3 or 4 years more as soon as. In order to achieve these goals, we will eliminate current restrictions that we have now that to increase the production of natural gas in the future. With that, having these cheap natural gas, we'll have also cheap electricity, that it will help our productivity in the industry and all country. That it's many companies and factors that they were moving to China in the past, now for cost reasons, now are returning to Mexico, and that it will be something that we expect to have in the future with this, with the reform, and also that that we can keep, if we can keep in all the region this cheap energy, and mainly with the prices of natural gas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, the boss, the guy who carries the same surname as the name of this venerable institution, Mr. Wilson, is telling me that our lunch speaker has arrived, and so we're going to have to cut this session short. What I would urge you to do is to engage with our panelists during the lunch session, which comes right up, which is on the same floor, moving over into the dining room area of the 6th floor. What's key out of this session is, of course, that infrastructure, once again, is the central issue. In order to actually build a competitive market and a truly efficient energy market across the border, we need to have those connections in place. Thank you to our panelists, and we'll see you all at lunch. Many thanks.
That was quick. That was quick.
Yeah.